Welcome everyone to another edition of a NACON Australia podcast. It's my pleasure today to welcome John Roskam. John is the former executive director and now senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, a think tank based in Melbourne, Australia. He writes a regular column for the Australian Financial Review, which he's done for over 20 years. I always enjoy it. I commend everyone to read last week's column on the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, which outlines some of the serious problems with the arts industry in Australia. So welcome, John.
Great to be with you, Dan. Looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. I'm going to start off talking about some historical questions with you about the development of liberalism and the centre right in Australia generally, and then deal with some more contemporary issues. So let's dive into the historical stuff first, because the Institute for Public Affairs is probably the most well-known centre-right think tank in Australia, and it's also the one that has the longest continuous history, having been established in 1943. But it's true to say that some of the policy positions of the IPA that the IPA has advocated over the years have changed a bit. For example, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's correct that at its founding and until the late 70s, early 80s, it was in favour of, or at least unconcerned about, Australia's high tariff regime. What, in your view, caused this change in thinking?
Well, it's a great question, Dan, and you're right. In 1943, when the IPA was founded by a group of businessmen in Melbourne, the main concern was post-war reconstruction and the likelihood of a socialist agenda coming to Australia, as they feared and as eventuated, for example, in the UK. So the IPA was supported by Melbourne and then national businesses who flourished behind the tariff war, and that supported, exactly as you outlined, Dan, the so-called Australian settlement. So the IPA had many manufacturers that supported it. It had the big banks that supported it. It had many of Australia's largest companies, and that was continued until the 1970s. Australian businesses supported tariff walls, industry protection, the system of industrial arbitration, which by and large the IPA supported. What happened then in the 1970s was, as happened across the Western world, reality hit. The recession of the late 60s, early 70s, and then the Whitlam government changed a lot of the perceptions around the Australian economy. And then the IPA and the CIS, founded in the 70s by our friend Greg Lindsay, started to adopt free market positions. The IPA was very influenced by Milton Friedman's visit. The IPA brought out Frederick Hayek in the early 1970s, and that started to change the debate. And at the same time, big business started walking away from support for free markets. So you're right to identify a significant change that came across the IPA, and I think Australia's intellectual and policy environment in the early 70s leading into the late 70s.
Yeah, right. So the economic liberalisation of the 80s and 90s are often presented as sort of correcting an intellectual policy error that had persisted in Australia for 70 plus years. And these well-known businessmen were simply sort of well-meaning and civic-minded and all the rest of it, didn't quite understand global markets. At least the 80s Hawke-Keating-Howard era is always presented as more economically and intellectually superior and more morally enlightened than what came before. Well, I think it's fair to say, right? But wouldn't it be better understood that what happened in the 80s and 90s was really only possible because of the geopolitical environment that existed at the time, most notably the economic and security dominance of the United States? If you had tried to float the dollar in the 1930s, where there were competing currency blocks, you would have been bumped around like a dodgem car. If you had tried to dramatically lower tariffs and too early, then in an environment where there were much more hostile kind of actors, and where your economic security and industrial base was far more important, then you wouldn't have been able to do so, and it wouldn't have been prudent or wise to do so at the time. Is that fair?
I think that's about. I think that's a fair assessment, but I think that's about half of it. If we go back, as I've got older, I've tended to have a slightly more generous view of the 50s and 60s. The Australian settlement of that time, Australia could afford. And as you identified, the free trade, the capitalism or market capitalism, however you define the new right of the 1980s, exactly as you outlined, took place because of the hegemony of the United States. So I think the idea that one system was better than the other, I think is being historicist. In the 50s, 60s and early 70s, Australia, to a very large degree, flourished under the Australian settlement until we could afford it no longer. Now, we can talk about why we couldn't afford it. We can talk about the stagflation of the 70s worldwide. We can talk about the changing intellectual milieu. We can talk about the industrialization of Asia and the impact on that. But I think the argument is that the policy settings, the policies we adopt are very largely, as you've identified, connected to the circumstances of the time, and the circumstances of the 1980s were very different to the circumstances, let's say, of the election of the Menzies government in 1949. And you mentioned the floating of the dollar. It's not that in the 1940s and 50s anyone was suggesting floating of the dollar, but there were an influential group of backbenchers in the Australian Federal Parliament long before the so-called dries, who didn't necessarily want to float the dollar, but who were looking at and hoping that exchange rates could be liberalised to some extent, that a lot of the industry protection could be changed, and they were firmly slapped down by Menzies. The Liberal government of the 50s and 60s were just as keen to support the Keynesian consensus as the Labor Party.
Who are you referring to? Because you're talking about before Burke Kelly and the dries and that movement. You're talking about
Yes.
what, the Vernon Committee guys? Is that who?
Before the Vernon Committee, there were people like Hughes in the 50s. There were a whole series. Interestingly, many of the people arguing for free trade before Burke Kelly were returned servicemen. They were small business people or had a background in small business, and of course were farmers. So we tend to think that Australian farmers universally supported Blackjack McEwen. That wasn't the case. There were free trade farmers in the Liberal Party, but Menzies' response, the response of Treasury, the response of the public servants, was very firmly against any change to the prevailing economic sentiment. So, absolutely, we have to give credit to Bert Kelly. We have to give credit to people like Heinz Arndt and so on. But there was a group even in the 40s and 50s, but they were small and they had very little power.
I mean, the 80s, 90s isn't the first time there's been a global free trade, era. The late 19th century, under the then hegemon of the Britain, also had
the Royal Navy.
The Royal Navy, was the US Navy of its day, right? And there were even kind of antecedents to Milton Friedman, economists of the day, who were explaining to people why Alfred Marshall and these people were talking about, why it all makes sense and refining their economics and this, that, and the other. But then, not only Australia in 1900, but many other countries, in fact, the United States beforehand and Canada and other places beforehand, started to put up tariff walls. They didn't sort of agree with what was coming out of the imperial capital in London. Why do you think that is? Why did not only Australia, but Canada, the United States, New Zealand, the colonies, well in advance of the UK, erect tariff walls?
A series of reasons. One, as I mentioned, because it was perceived we could afford it. Two, it was the accepted intellectual orthodoxy. And three, I think if we go back to the settlement in 1901, it was seen to be a method and system of economic growth. So when you look at why Victoria and Melbourne in Australia was the centre of protection, well, we had rapid population growth during the gold rush. And then by the 1880s, 1890s, there was a very lively public discussion about what to do with a growing population, and manufacturing was seen to be the direction for that population to be employed in, and protection was not just an economic necessity, but remember, it had a very strong intellectual support, as you've identified at the time. And even people like John Stuart Mill was saying, well, there is an intellectual case for the support of infant industries. And of course, we know that even infant industries, as they grow up, seek protection. So I think there was a series of things. And again, even at the end of the 19th century, you saw a debate about protection from Asia. When you look at Australia's White Australia policy at the time, it was very much framed around community and nations, populous nations to Australia's north, that Federation Father said worked harder, would work for lower wages, were more committed to getting out of poverty than many of those in Australia. So it was a whole series of things that gave us an accepted policy at the time that was accepted through the English-speaking world.
Oh, well, in the colonies, at least, in the New World.
Well, in the colonies, yes. New
UK,
World. Not the UK, you're right. Not the UK.
No, that's right. And they maintained it. There was a bit of discussion with Joseph Chamberlain and these people, but following the colonies' lead. So let's go to Federation, John, because I know we have a slightly different take on it. You reviewed recently a book by Dr. William Coleman, who I've met, and he's a very amicable chap and a very knowledgeable chap. His book was called Their Fiery Cross of Union, and it basically paints a very negative picture of the reasons for federation and the personalities involved. Really kind of gives them the warts and all treatment. Now, my question is this, right? On the right, we always tend to say those on the left have a very negative, black armband view of Australian history. But isn't it also true that liberals, or at least people consider themselves, the bastion of, embodiment of liberalism, also to some extent have a disappointed view? I won't say spiteful, but a disappointed view of history from federation until sort of the tariff regime started to come down in the Whitlam and Hawke era. We sort of think to themselves, they might have been, Menzies and others, and might have been avuncular, civic-minded chaps, but they kind of didn't understand, and it was all a big detour that we should not have taken, and Australia suffered for that during that entire period, the 70+ years from federation until, the new age. Is that a fair? And if only we had listened to George Reid, and if only we'd listened to Bruce Smith or Joseph Carruthers and these types, then we would have all done so much better. Alas and alack,
And if only Edmund Barton and Alfred Deakin had been nowhere near the Treasury benches, Australia would have been better. So I'll agree with a large part of that assessment of that, but I'll balk at one thing first. The argument of the left is an argument, I think, against the Australian nation and against Western civilization and against the culture that has made Australia the wonderful country that it is. The argument of the right, or at least for someone such as me, is that Australia could have even been better. So it is certainly the case, as I've said, that until the 1970s, absent, of course, the late 1920s, the Depression in the 30s, Australia had economic success and it could afford the policies it entertained. But I go back to a discussion I had with my politics lecturer in second or third year university at Melbourne University many years ago. and we were talking about federation, and I had the temerity to say in a tutorial, wouldn't it have been better if Australia hadn't federated? No one could believe any such statement. And I remember as I don't know, 18, 19-year-old, I said, well, Renaissance Italy wasn't federated. It wasn't a single unifying, stultifying state. It was a series of communities that competed and were different and collaborated and corroborated. So that's always been my argument. And I'm so glad you mentioned William Coleman's book, because Coleman mounts the argument about federation that's significant for a few reasons. He says federation was an elite project. It didn't have much to do with the people. And I think we've seen Australia as a history of elite projects disconnected from mainstream popular opinion. Coleman makes a very strong argument that there was no economic or defence necessity for federation. And he makes the point, which I have a great degree of sympathy with, which is that elite project created jobs for lawyers and public servants. And that is an argument that, of course, the great Hancock made in the 1930s. So I think William Coleman's book is a wonderful corrective to the idea that federation was inevitable, that federation was necessary, and that federation provided results that allowed Australia to flourish.
Isn't he saying, in a sense, that isn't he disappointed in Australia because they didn't agree with his policy prescriptions on trade and immigration and the like? And isn't it possible to say that, or at least be reasonably make the argument that a restrictionist immigration program, which was adopted at Federation, and the high tariff regime, if they had not been introduced and maintained, Australia would not have become as economically secure and as socially cohesive as it was. It didn't have, the type of ethnic turmoil which bedeviled Europe, and it was terrible. We had it was the safest place in the world to be a Jew in the 20th century. You can't say that of other parts of the world, right? And so, didn't the much maligned Australian settlement doesn't it deserve credit for that? Because
no, so go on.
Oh, well, leave it at that. Answer that one.
No, because the settlement had many different aspects. The settlement had an economic aspect, and as you said, I think Australia would have been better off adopting the free trade policies of George Reid than the protection policies of Deakin. But the issue of immigration and cultural homogeneity, I think, is something quite different. The homogeneity of Australia, our cultural cohesiveness, which you are absolutely right to identify, I think is a product of a couple of things. It is a product of, up until recently, relatively controlled immigration. Now, the absence of federation, I don't think, would have challenged that controlled immigration program anyway. But it was also a product of what you could call a cultural bedrock of liberal democracy, of freedom of speech, of Australia as a new frontier to create an environment in which we could all flourish. My argument is that Australia isn't multicultural. Australia is multi-ethnic. Our cultural foundations are those of the West. They are founded in 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian history and culture and understanding and wisdom. And I don't think that federation cast those foundations. Those foundations were here in 1788. They were here when the debates about Chartism arrived in the 1850s and 1860s. I think that bedrock is more important than a debate about federation in 1901.
But couldn't you have foreseen a situation where parts of Queensland or Northern Australia wanted cheap Asia labor from Asia, and that over time that that may have introduced challenges at that stage, right? In 1900, when Asia was far, far, far poorer than it is today, and there would have been commercial interests. Indeed, there were commercial interests that were arguing for, Kanaka labour and to cut cane in the my neck of the woods, North Queensland, and that would have. I mean, I think people like Geoffrey Blaney have argued this. There was live consideration, and people realised that you could develop Northern Australia quicker if you had adopted that policy, because would have provided labour for agricultural interests. It's hard yakka in Northern Australia, especially in the summer, but it would have it would have posed threats to the sort of polity of Australia and the middle class and the cohesion that we had for from 1900 until 1950s plus. And it wasn't simply an ideological or kind of alone compact which kept the country together. It was the shared cultural ties and everything else which made the later waves of immigrants, the Italians and Latvians and Greeks and all the rest of them, and then later Asian immigration, it made that possible. Whereas if other parts of the world, you're talking like South Africa or even Fiji, where you have the Malay Peninsula, where you have basically ethnic conflicts, and we were able to avoid that here because we kept it under control, at least for the first 50 plus years. Isn't that why, for example, it was a popular policy? And isn't it why, if you had listened to the sort of open borders guys of the late 1900s, like George Reid and the rest of them, you would have had, at least would have ended up with a worse result than what was achieved through federation and the policies and the Australian settlement that was adopted then.
See, but I don't think that was a product of federation. You've talked about Geoffrey Blaney's assessment of the future of Australia if the North had been allowed to develop differently with a different migration program. And I think it was Stuart McIntyre who's spoken about the potential of cutting Australia basically in half. But I don't regard, let's call it cultural cohesiveness or sense of nationhood, for want of a better term, as a product of the political settlement of 1901. I regard it as a product of 150 years of British settlement beforehand. And I also think that the argument that you're presenting about the development of Northern Australia, I think would have in the long run been unsustainable. I think there were arguments even in Queensland about it happening then. And I hear your argument, but I don't accept it necessarily, that it was federation that then brought Queensland and its immigration policies into the Commonwealth and then created the relatively harmonious society that we have enjoyed until very, very recently.
Because Australia, it wasn't just the much maligned Victorians at Federation who were dreaming up these new sort of schemes. The United States had a similar policy, at least, and a lot earlier, from Abraham Lincoln. High tariff policy. The Canadians under John A. Macdonald, they adopted under the national policy. They had the same thing. New Zealanders had the same thing. So it was popular. And it wasn't as though these guys, I like to say, it wasn't as though, Menzies had never heard of Adam Smith. He's a Presbyterian Scot. I would have suffered through enough Burns nights to know that I would know he's Adam Smith, right? But there's a little bit of the impression given, that, oh, no, he'd never heard of it. He was uninterested in economics. And here, Tim Wilson's dusted off Adam Smith and given it to him, and he's discovered it anew, right? It doesn't ring true. And when you put it in context, because I've struggled with this, is why didn't Menzies believe the same thing as John Howard did? In fact, John Howard, in his book on Menzies, I've got it here, he says, he poses the question: as someone directly involved in the reform process of the last 30 years in opposition as well as in government, I've often reflected on why it was that so many of our previous economics policies, both institutional arrangements and attitudes of mind, remained so fixed for so long. And the desire to better understand this was one of the reasons that led me to write this book. That is the John Howard book on Menzies. And it's almost got me thinking, reading that, Liberal Party that John Howard joined, you know, he wasn't a free trading kind of guy when he joined the Liberal Party either. That came later. I mean, it's almost as though he didn't understand the reasons what the party believed in that he was joining.
Well, there's a couple of things in what you say. So I'm going to date the original sin of Australia's federation to 1890s. But once we federated, once we'd gone through the horrors of the First World War and the consequences of the First World War. If we remember, for example, in the 1920s, was something like a third of the federal budget was war pensions. When we went through that and we went through the Depression and then the Second World War, Menzies created an environment and participated in an environment that was hugely successful and beneficial for Australia. So I'm not going to second guess Menzies, I'm going to second guess Deakin. And it is the case that Menzies perhaps might have been able to do a few things differently. My critique of the Menzies government relates to things such as the overriding, or the development of the overriding role of the Commonwealth. For example, in higher education, I think the Menzies government failed when it didn't repeal uniform tax and we didn't have a system of competitive federalism. Those are my critiques of Menzies. I think Menzies completely failed as an arbiter, for example, in the Suez crisis. But by and large, I'm going to argue Menzies was a very good government and prime minister, but it was by the end of the Menzies era that settlement was becoming undone. So I'm going to accept a large part of your premise. I'm going to accept the premise that under Menzies, and I write about this all the time. People say, well, the Menzies years were, years of unreconstructed backwardness. Well, exactly as you said, Dan. In the Menzies government, in the Menzies period, there weren't armed guards at Jewish schools. In the years of Menzies, we didn't have thousands of Australians turning out in support of terrorism. In the years of Menzies, we didn't have an entire generation of young people educated to hate and loathe the country that they live in.
Or locked out of home ownership,
or locked out of home ownership. And so to come back to William Coleman, to come back to federation, I think once the stones of federation have been set, Menzies did the very best he could.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of his book, he sort of, I find it a little bit, it's almost like he whimsically says, oh, we might have been better if we'd federated somehow later, and we could have had city-states or something along the eastern.
Yes, absolutely, Dan.
And much as I admire like the Renaissance city-states and all the rest of it, and the warring period in China, and accept that during those times you do get a lot of intellectual kind of dynamism. I mean, nations beat little city-states, as the example of Hong Kong kind of shows, right? You can have the most dynamic little sort of trading port, but there's an advantage in having a nation. And that's what, even like Machiavelli, part of the reason why he was writing his works was because he was trying to explain to the Italians, look, we've got these new nations effectively in France and then England, that we need to think about this thing anew. And the Italians in due course did, I know a lot later, but did form a nation there on the Italian peninsula, as did the Germans. And this is late 19th century, as did, it was the beginnings of the Jewish state in Israel, and that project was the beginnings of the Irish, Republic, and it was the beginnings of the Australian country.
Dan,
and I feel like, sorry,
I'm going to push back and say, how's the nation state going? I'm going to push back and say the choice of a nation state is not Hong Kong versus China. The state, the choice that we have, and I'm by and large in support of nation states, but they don't have to be the nation state that we have in Australia at the moment. We have the most centralized so-called federation in the world. We have a national curriculum that is imposed upon every child in Australia, regardless whether they're a government or non-government school, and regardless of what parents think. We have very little economic
outside of China, John. Outside of China.
Indeed, but we have very little economic dynamism. There is no competition between the states. We have federal economic policy that dampens competition in a policy sense, in an economic sense, between the states. So I don't think it's the choice of Hong Kong versus China, Russia, or Brazil, or the United States. I think what William Coleman was pointing out is that federation could have happened in a slightly different way, and I'm going to very firmly argue Australia would have had better results
compared to, like, what, better
compared
than
to what we
Canada?
have now. No,
Okay.
compared to what we have now and what Australia's had over the last decade.
Okay.
And again, and a final point, I think you can also demonstrate that the glory years that you and I will agree with to some extent of the 1950s and 60s were before Canberra's overweening presence. Now, Canberra was developing a different role, but the states were different. Under a unified nation state, you couldn't have, for example, Joh Bjelke-Petersen ending death duties. That led to an economic revolution through Australia. So I'm happy to argue that Australia as a nation state, by and large, is a good thing, but I'm also going to argue that it didn't have to happen the way that it did.
Yeah, Queensland removed death duties before free market bastions of Singapore and Hong Kong. I remember it well, and it was a large part of for Joh's popularity, particularly from people on the land. When they died, you had to have the death assessor come out and basically value all the family silver. So that's baked into family folklore. Moving on to more contemporary issues. You'd be familiar with the term the Washington Consensus, right? Developed in the sort of 90s, sort of post-Reagan, Thatcher, and described as being, free open borders, free trade, finance, and to a certain extent, very sympathetic to open immigration as well. That has changed. I mean, the current Washington Consensus has changed since 2016. And I was chatting with a friend of ours, Samuel Gregg. He accepts that. I don't think it's controversial to say. On trade, and this is probably the area which is most where the Americans now, the Canberra Consensus differs most dramatically from the New Washington Consensus, because it's now bipartisan on trade that the United States will maintain high tariffs on China. Trump's proposing make them even higher. And introduce a broad-based tariff regime in the United States. And we are not there, right? We are bipartisan. Your lovely terminology, the chairman's lounge set in Australia, they celebrate the fact that we are still having, 100% manufactured goods can be imported from China duty-free. They're patting themselves on the back that any of the turbulence or sort of turmoil regarding some of the duties that China had imposed on some of our agricultural products has now been almost solved. And off they go, the chairman's lounge set, tucking into their oysters. But where exactly are they going? They're not really giving a thought to exactly where things are heading. And in the United States, there has been, not only with Donald Trump and his sort of impulsive, intuitive grasping of some of the problems at least, but now the J.D. Vances, or more like the thinking man's Trump, who have developed, in addition to a lot of other people, developed this out a lot for and explained, tariffs, much maligned tariffs, can make sense in particular circumstances. But we haven't changed on that, have we, John? I mean, where do you stand? Should the Australia-China trade arrangements be renegotiated or what?
Well, they might need to be, but there's so much in what you said that's really important. There's a few things I'd identify. America is large. It can afford to insure. It can afford to put those tariff walls up. Australia is a small trading nation, as we have always been in the last century. I think there's a few things happening that Australia doesn't have to choose between extreme tariffs or extreme free trade. I think you're right to identify the Washington Consensus is breaking, and it probably deserves to be broken for a whole series of reasons. For me, the most powerful aspect of J.D. Vance's argument is around the working class. And we were talking earlier about the aspects of the discussion that you would see in America that you won't see in Australia. There's no discussion of the working class. There's no discussion of people outside of Australia's major cities. So Australia's way forward is not necessarily all of one or the other, but it is to understand the failure of our policies. I think the decline of manufacturing in Australia is very largely a result of industrial relations and Australia's net zero commitments, and the coalition supports net zero. And the sooner the coalition says it no longer abides by net zero and that it is going to prioritise energy security and affordability and reliability, not only will the country be better off, but Peter Dutton or the coalition will return to government much sooner. The other aspects of the Washington consensus are around immigration.
Just on the trade stuff, though, because I'll come to the immigration and the foreign policy stuff, where I think the other key areas that have changed. But the America still has cheap energy. It has nuclear power. It has a much more liberal industrial relations regime than Australia does. It has got worse probably over the last couple of years, but it's still far superior to what we have, at least freer than what we have. And still, J.D. Vance, Vice President nominee from the manufacturing heart of the United States, says that that's not enough. And so Australia, even if we got all the nuclear power plants, even if we got the most US style industrial relations regime, we would still not be able to produce manufactured goods at the price that China, with its different social compact and vast labor pool, could do, right? And I think that was recognized back in 1900. And those guys thought to themselves, we will, in order to equalize that, we've established this well-run, ordered market and a middle class. And so we need to protect ourselves so that we have our own industrial base, not only for national security reasons, but because you can't have a liberal democracy unless you have a strong, deep middle class like we did under that previous regime. So I guess my question is doesn't there need to be some new thinking on trade in Australia like there has been in the United States?
Oh, there absolutely does need to be some new thinking, but Australia can't afford to slide into autarky. Again, it is not one or the other. And you're right to identify J.D. Vance as saying, well, America has all these things that I'd like Australia to have, and they still have these deep problems. But then I'm going to go a bit deeper. And I'm going to say, when you look at Hillbilly Elegy, yes, it's about economic policies, but it's about cultural policies. It's about fatherlessness. It's about the decline of the family. It is the decline of meaning. It is about all of those things that governments wish they had a handle on, but thankfully they don't, because these are policies that emanate from people and families and communities. So the argument that Australia will prosper if we were to simply copy some of the Trump policies or the J.D. Vance policies, I don't think stands up, because Australia is too small. I fear what it would do to our dollar. I fear what...
And we're back on, John. So you were saying you didn't think that the United States, Australia should adopt So you were saying, John, just before we got cut off, that you didn't think that it made sense for Australia to adopt the same type of trade regime that have been proposed by the likes of J.D. Vance and Trump, if they get re-elected.
That's right, because Australia is a small trading country, doesn't have the advantages of the US as a reserve currency. It doesn't have the size or its scale, but that is not to say, and that is not to ignore your key point, that the idea of free trade as an unalloyed good shouldn't be challenged. I think Australia in 2024 is still very largely working off the paradigm that economic liberalisation in China will bring about political liberalisation. That has been proved to be wrong. I think the arguments about the end of history and Fukuyama, his point that liberal democracy is inevitable and its success will always win out, I think has done huge harm and huge damage to
Yeah.
the debate around how we maintain liberal democracy. So we need to understand the nature of China. We need to understand the regime, and we trade with it and other like regimes as we can when it is to our national advantage. But your point that let's understand free trade is not always to the national advantage, I think is very well made. And I think you're right to identify that the United States has come to this realization faster than Australia has.
Yeah, and I just think I don't like the terms like autarky or even protectionism. I like
Yeah.
trade realism. You know, it's not a either or, a set or forget, and the solution ultimately won't be 1,000% tariffs on any goods coming into Australia, but it will be based on a realization that trading with New Zealand is trading different to trading with China, trading with the United States is different. And so each of those trading relationships should reflect that and calibrate that. And it shouldn't be so dogmatic that if you so much as propose a little tariff here and a little tariff there, or even a big tariff here and a big tariff there on particular goods, that therefore you're somehow, I don't know, a throwback to some
No,
benighted age.
and again, to go to your point, we need to understand that many of the tariffs that the Chinese government imposed on Australian products were done unilaterally.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, again, what JD Vance and others and Cass have identified is that there is a whole program around this. Australia needs to understand the costs of an energy policy that has seen our household electricity prices go from some of the lowest and cheapest in the world to now the most expensive, and that applies to manufacturing as well. It goes to our training and education systems. It goes to a whole raft of things, and I think for too long Australians have said, well, free trade will fix most things. Well, I
Mm.
will support free trade, but it doesn't fix most things. Your free trade or any sort of trading regime in the national interest has to be maintained by a whole series of policies around it.
Another area where there's been a big divergence from the traditional Washington/Canberra consensus is in relation to foreign policy. And it's just striking to me today that, like, the way Tony Abbott talks about Ukraine in that, Churchillian type of manner is very different to JD Vance, where he explicitly says, I don't care that much about it, and there are some parts of the world that simply aren't any of our business, and that we need to not, put all our eggs in one basket. That type of sentiment. It's the way Donald Trump talks about Iraq is very different to the way John Howard talks about Iraq, and he still, I believe, and defends it as being a good and noble kind of cause, and the rest of it. And again, I think there hasn't been in Australia, in the way there has in the United States, a reassessment of sort of the last 30 years of interventionist foreign policy, for want of a better word. Is that fair, do you think? And
I
should there
think
be?
I think that's a fair assessment. There should be, and I think it's happening in America first, because it's Americans that pay the taxes to fight the wars and sacrifice the young men to the battlefields. In
Okay.
Australia, we tend to look to the US. We tend to think better of America than Americans do themselves. And and it's important that you mentioned Iraq, we tend to think that Americans are better at nation building than in fact they are. We tend to think Americans are better at fighting wars than they are. And this is now a long overdue assessment of American policy since the 1970s. And it's uncomfortable for Australians because Australians need to ask, in the uncertain world and region in which we inhabit, what is Australia's strategic interest to America? And I think this reassessment is well overdue. I am more likely to share Tony Abbott's view of Ukraine than Donald Trump or JD Vance's assessment. But Donald Trump and JD Vance will also probably be more willing to understand the limits to US power. In Australia, we have regarded to a very large extent on a bipartisan basis US authority as being unlimited, their capacity for spending unlimited. That is now no longer the case.
Which, going forward, what framework can we use for deciding which policy, which interventions or foreign conflicts Australia does get involved in? Because it seems to me, there will always be terrible things that go on in the world, terrible ethnic conflicts, terrible. I mean, we're just so blessed here in Australia that we don't experience and have no real experience of it, except those that have come from those places. And then will no doubt be additional conflicts which will tug at the heartstrings. And the realist view would say that's terrible. It's all very well, but does it affect Australia's vital interests? And that's one test. But I'm interested in your view. Where, if there was a conflict that breaks out in, God knows where, South America or somewhere else, which involved some bad
the Baltic
dude,
states.
Baltic states, some bad dude doing
very
something.
live question.
Yeah, does that mean we get involved because we need to defend the international global order? Is that?
No, we don't need to defend the international global order. We get involved if America needs us. That's the realist in me. When I listen to Paul Keating and others who are doubtful about AUKUS, and you can have an argument about the effectiveness of AUKUS and the timetable and the costs and so on, but there is no world in which I can see in which Australia has an independent capacity to defend itself against aggression. So enough of me of a realist is to say that America, for good or for ill, under a Harris presidency or a Trump presidency or whoever follows them, is Australia's best and most important ally. And that is the preeminent consideration first.
I don't disagree with that the alliance with the United States is the ultimate sort of realist consideration. And I guess it would be good for Australia, at least from some view, to say that if there's going to be a more quote unquote restrained or non-interventionist US foreign policy, it does mean maintain the alliance, but not have to be required.
And we have to understand our very limited capacity for independent action. I think, for example, the military helicopters that the Australian Defence Force destroyed rather than give to Ukraine should have gone to Ukraine. But we understand the limits. We can understand the limits to the small size of the ADF. We can understand the limits to the unwillingness of the Australian population to increase its per capita spending on defence. And we can also understand the limits to the political debate, because I think the coalition and the right of the Labor Party have taken it for granted that the US alliance is always going to be supported by the Australian public, and it is for the moment, but there is no guarantee that is going to continue. And then on top of that, you have, and the Labor Party have spoken about this, the growing Muslim vote, which has political consequences, which is a key issue being debated in Australia at the moment. And that is going to also ultimately potentially limit our capacity for action.
Yeah, I mean, that segues nicely into the next topic, which is where there has been a reconsideration, at least in the United States, and that is in relation to immigration. And this is an area where at least Australia we have been very successful, far more successful than the United States or the UK at cracking down on illegal immigration. It still jars in some ways listening to Republicans from the Reagan era talk about how there really was an open border, somewhat utopian kind of view that all of Mexico could sort of move up into the United States and it would all be for the best. And George W. Bush was famously, so his line was that family values don't stop at the Rio Grande, and therefore, I don't know, what does that mean? Are there any limits on the whole of Mexico moving to Texas? So that has been an area which has changed, and famously, Donald Trump, his line was he was going to build a wall to stop that form of illegal immigration crossing the border. But mass immigration has also, that is mass legal immigration, has also become a much more live topic than it once was, especially given the last 2 years of record numbers here in Australia, record numbers in the UK. Probably fair to say that it was a large part of the reason why the Tories got so successful, dramatically kicked out of office there. Mass immigration on a non-discriminatory basis has been bipartisan policy since the new liberal era. And it's such a sensitive issue, and I sort of hate discussing it, but because no doubt someone down in Victoria or somewhere else will get annoyed at me. But what should be done? Is it a simpler solution to simply say, look, we're not going to discriminate on any basis, certainly not on religious or racial grounds, but let's at least dramatically lower the numbers for a period of time, so that we have a period of time when the great magic of Australian culture can work and assimilate the people that we have already here. Isn't that? What do you think? What is the correct sort of centre-right response to immigration at the moment?
Well, there's a couple of aspects. One is you can't run a mass migration program as Australia is and then not integrate newcomers and not attempt to integrate newcomers. I am not fussed about whether we call it integration or assimilation. I am the child of post-war European migrants. They assimilated into Australia. They became something different. They became Australians first. Doesn't mean you're not proud of your heritage or where you have come from. You are Australian first. So the first point is we can't maintain a mass migration program the way we are doing. The second point is whether we should even maintain the mass migration program that we are. And I think the evidence is quite clear that the levels of migration that Australia has focused on has got huge social and economic consequences, most notably pushing up the price of housing. Thirdly, I think we can discriminate, but we don't discriminate on the basis of religion or ethnicity. We discriminate on the basis of Australian values. I have written about the fact that it is absolutely appropriate that if you are a resident of Gaza attempting to claim refugee status or come to Australia under any form, if you have indicated support for Hamas, however defined, you don't get to come into this country. What Australians have been afraid to talk about, and Dan, you put your finger on it, our non-discriminatory policy has become a policy that accepts all comers regardless of their values. And that's a debate that Australians have to have. And over the last few weeks, we've seen how the security agencies and the Labor Party have glossed over that question. They won't give the Australian public a straight answer. And the elites have in Australia, by and large, and many people have spoken about this, have run an immigration program and the outline of a program that has never been put to the Australian public. Australia's migration program over the last 20 years is the clearest example of the vast divide between elite opinion leaders and the rest of the public. And these are debates we are going to have. Otherwise, they will be forced upon us in ways of our that we haven't chosen. and the terrible, terrible scenes on the forecourt of the Sydney Opera House on the 8th of October identified for many Australians that this is a discussion we are going to have to have.
Mm. And so, how do you do it? I mean, because I remember I had put a similar type question to Gary Johns, a mutual friend of ours, and also Campbell Newman, and they sort of came to the same conclusion you did, but they said, well, you either have to have an offshore processing place which determines someone's values before they come to Australia. I think that was Gary's solution. Or Campbell, if they breach their oath of allegiance, which they sign up to when they make their get their citizenship, then they have to get voted out. And both of those, I see huge practical problems with.
Oh,
um,
look, absolutely. And we're going to have to find a way through this. But I think there's a few other
yeah,
things we can do. We can make citizenship harder to obtain.
yeah.
We should be not reluctant to impose tests on the great privilege that is Australian citizenship. And I think whether it's offshore processing for values or exactly as you said, Campbell Newman talking about deporting those who breach values. I think deportations are notoriously difficult, but there's going to have to be some way of doing it. And the first thing you would do is you would start to limit the mass migration program that we have right now. I think where the coalition has talked about limiting and reducing, I think is exactly right, and the government has recognised some of this, even with the changes they're making to overseas students in Australian universities.
Okay, just two more questions. It's this one. What I think the changing consensus on trade, immigration, and foreign policy has in common is that it's some level it's a critique of open borders liberalism. Trade. It says we're not just an economic zone. We need to have borders, economic borders, to maintain some level of economic sovereignty and industrial capacity. With immigration, it says we're a nation we're a people. We're not simply a platform that you can come
We're
and
not a
go. And
hotel.
we're not a hotel. A boarding house to the world, I think, is Theodore Roosevelt's line. But talking about the United States in the early 20th century. And on foreign policy, when someone bleeds on the other side of the world, just because they happen to believe in freedom and liberty and all the nice sort of enlightenment values, that doesn't make them Australian, and therefore then we need to have a more hard-headed assessment about whether that is something we need to get involved with as well. And I think in the post-war Cold War period, because it was such a lovely ideological win, right? A peaceful ideological win. I mean, there were skirmishes throughout, but it was a lovely debate and the sort of good guys type one. And we sort of now think it bred a utopianism that everything's ideological. It's just a debate that we will ultimately be able to prevail if we just argue, nice opinion pieces in in the papers and stuff. And actually, like the world's some of these conflicts are sort of intractable, and then there will always be countries that won't necessarily become friends if you trade with them, and there's not always a win-win situation in these in any of these types of circumstances. How do you distinguish that type of liberalism, which I'm sure you probably share some of my concerns about, from the liberalism which is often seen as sort of all goodness and light, and something that Australia on the centre right should use as its guiding light?
A couple of aspects. Key question. It's human nature to be utopian. I want to believe in utopian liberalism. I want to believe that democracy follows trade. I want to believe that people in the world want me to live the life I want to live with my family, and I would do the same for them. I think we have realised that history has restarted, and history restarted, I think, in 2001. I think a few other things have happened. We had assumed, exactly as you said, that with the victory of the Cold War, the rest of the world lives like us and wants to live like us. Sadly, that is not true. And at the same time as history has restarted, the West has not just lost faith in itself, but significant aspects of the West are assaulting the values of liberal democracy that have created the world that hitherto has been a good one for those lucky enough to live in the West. So a whole series of things are happening. We tended to assume that the cultural foundations and assumptions on which we would welcome new Australians, regardless of their background or faith, would integrate those people into Australia or assimilate them into Australia, and that there would be something to be integrated into. That has now gone as well. And I think the reason why this sort of discussion that we're having that's been so good today is happening around the world is because a series of things are happening at the same time. We have economic challenges, we have international relations challenges, and our greatest challenge, I think, is cultural. So a whole series of things have come together to create uncertainty in the future that is reflected in the debates we're having, all the way down to the falling birth rates of the West. These are all connected. And then if you were to read The Economist, what we've been talking about would be seen to be nasty populism, Dan. And we have seen the elites push back. We've seen the elites push back by controlling what we can say and what we think, by calling us names like populism. And for me, populism is simply democracy. We've seen the reaction against the mob. We have seen elites attempting to buttress themselves in power. We have seen how the elites turned their back on Brexit, how they've attempted to undermine Trump, how even here in Australia on the Voice referendum, which was the largest expression of popular opinion on such a significant issue around cultural cohesion, the elites have basically ignored the results, and the centre-right in Australia hasn't taken it as a signal to renew the fight for our freedoms and our values. So a whole series of things has come together, and we're trying to find a way through. I think this has happened to the United States first, which is why, as you've identified, these debates in the US have been going for some 5 or 10 years, if not longer. The US is bigger. The US is more diverse in so many ways, especially intellectually. And the fact that we are now only starting to have these conversations in Australia, I think, is a testament to the iron grip of the elites on the public debate. Because, Dan, you and I could walk around Parliament House tomorrow and we could talk to coalition MPs, and you'd say, talk to me about the national conservatism debates of Europe and America, and 99% of MPs, coalition or Labor or any other sort, wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about.
I think you said to me, John, when we first I first reached out to you on this, there's probably only about 10 people in Australia who understand what national conservatism is. I've heard of it, and about at least 5 of those would be vehemently against it. So it's a very, very small pool of people. But look, I really appreciate the discussion. It's a very useful one. I was as free tradey as you were back in the day, John. I was a director of a free market think tank in Hong Kong, and I like to say, what is it? A conservative, a liberal that was mugged by reality. Well, I was a free trade liberal that was mugged by some very bad sort of, by China in the broad, right? And so that's been the prompt for me to reassess some of these type of classically liberal positions and wonder, hang on, did I actually
and to interrupt you mid-sentence, Dan, we have to reassess these things. One of the things the centre-right hasn't done, which the left does, the centre-right doesn't renew itself. The centre-right doesn't have these arguments. Well, certainly in Australia, we don't debate these things, and we allow the left to define the terms of the debate. And we have to have, these sorts of discussions. And I think we have to take the lead of the US and people like Vance, who have put these questions on the agenda. And we need many more discussions such as this.
Agreed. One final question. It just relates to your future plans, and you're welcome to talk about any of the other things that you plan to do in future, in addition to your work at the IPA. But I read that you're working on a book on George Orwell. Is that still on the cards? And I have to. My mum hated the book by Wifedom by Anna Funder.
Oh, yes.
I'd just be very interested in your views on that, and whether it's sort of, well, you can make it form part of a broader critique, or if you will.
Look, I mean, one of the points of Wifedom is George Orwell was not a very good person. I think that's true, but it didn't stop him not just creating great art in some ways, but being, I think, one of the most acute critics of the 20th century in its broadest terms. The work is underway. It's continuing. It's been delayed as I'm writing up the consequences of The Voice and what the Voice referendum means for Australia. But for me, there's two or three key things that speak to all of us from Orwell's work. One is Orwell's identification of the use and manipulation of language, and we are seeing that at the moment across the English-speaking and West. Sorry, just go back again. Sorry, just give me a little. The significance of Orwell to today, I think, is at two or three levels. One is he identified the use and abuse of language, and the desire of totalitarians to control language. And when you control language and what we can say, you control what people think. Secondly, he identified the importance of history and our culture, and those who control the past control the future. This is absolutely relevant to what we've been talking about today, when we've identified the assault on our culture and on liberal democracy and on our freedoms. But this has only been, the final point about Orwell, I think, has only come home to me in the last few years. That wonderful line from 1984, "If there's hope, it rested with the proles." It's the people. And when we see the elite projects designed and implemented for elites without regard to people, to their interests, to those who are less well off than the elites, who can't afford the decisions that elites impose upon them, I think we see Orwell at his very finest. And for me, from all the aspects of Orwell, and there are so many, and he's such a powerful writer at many levels, I just think Orwell is a wonderful example of a great democrat, someone who believes in the people, someone who has faith in the people, someone who respects the people. And of course, there's in all of Orwell's writing, I think there's no better example of that than how Boxer, the representative of the people, is portrayed in Animal Farm. And for me, the debates that we're going through, the discussions we're having, is about how do we support people.
Awesome. Well, on that note, thanks very much, John. I really appreciated it, and I look forward to further discussions of this nature with different people going forward. Thanks again.
It's a great discussion. Thank you, Dan.
No worries. Cheers, mate. Bye.